So we've just wrapped up our discussions with Tendai in regards to the research that's been taking place under the PITAP project. We now have with us Henry Sunday. Henry, welcome.
Bulantia.
Bula. Henry works as the private sector development advisor. Henry, could you tell us a little bit about your role and how it's an enabler for improved trade within our region?
Okay, I look after the private sector development work program of the Secretariat under PITAP, and my main responsibility is the development or the formulation of a private sector development strategy for MSG. Yeah, this is in recognition of the key role that the private sector plays in development. Yeah, and you would have heard from my other colleagues the work that has been done on the Melanesian free trade area, trade agreement. Now the private sector is going to use that agreement. If you have the best agreement and the private sector cannot use it, then that agreement is meaningless. Yeah. So the key issue that we're addressing through my position here at the Secretariat is to help the private sector through both exporters and importers within the MSG region to be effective users of the MFTA, Melanesian Free Trade Area. Now, to enable that, we've got to enlighten and empower the private sector so that they can utilize the provisions of the trade agreement. Now, private sector development is often described as an enabler for improved trade, but what we would also say is private sector development is also an enabler for enhanced investment flows within the MSG sub-region. And in the absence of an MSG Trade Commission, which should really be facilitating trade and investment flows within the sub-region, we at the Secretariat have been playing a part in assisting the private sector, especially those exploring business opportunities in other MSG countries, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of investment. And even to the extent that they are seeking skilled workers to fulfill their human resource needs. We have numerous examples in that regard. Workers from Fiji being recruited into Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and the other way around as well. So what we do here to support the private sector is we've been linking up businesses, entities interested in doing business with their counterparts, not only within the MSG sub-region, but also with Australia and New Zealand, through the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat's network of Pacific Trade and Invest offices based in Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China, and Geneva. Likewise with neighboring Pacific Island countries, as well as the French territories in the Pacific, the closest one being New Caledonia. Now, one key aspect of our work is to link up trade and investment promotion agencies of each of our member countries. They are the arms of government that the private sector will go to in order to explore and facilitate, stimulate business across borders within the MSG sub-region and beyond the MSG sub-region. Linking them up, the private sector also has a key role to play here, especially through their peak representative bodies, like the Chambers of Commerce, national private sector organizations. Working in collaboration with them is vital if we are to make use of the opportunities available through the trade agreement. And in that regard, we at the Secretariat work very closely with the peak regional body for the private sector, and that is the Pacific Islands Private Sector Organization, or PIPSO in short, which is based in Suva, in Fiji.
Part of the discussion that has taken place has also mentioned MSG Private Sector Development Strategy, and I'm sure you are heavily engaged with this. Could you tell us a little bit about the key features of this strategy?
Firstly, I'd like to refer to the design or the formulation of the strategy. extensive in-country consultations took place in the middle of last year, soon after PEM here in Vanuatu. And we were supposed to start the consultations here, but because of the disaster, Vanuatu was the last country to be visited. So we started off in Papua New Guinea, then came over to Solomon Islands, then to Fiji, and ended up here in Vanuatu. Meeting with stakeholders, seeking their views, their criticisms, their suggestions with regards to having an effective private sector development strategy. And these stakeholders, we went beyond the capitals, visiting the highlands of Papua New Guinea and the islands of Papua New Guinea, as well as the Solomons, the Western Province. And in Fiji, we did likewise, Bonua Levu, as well as other parts of the Western Division, and also here in Vanuatu, where we also visited Tana and Santo. Now, those who we met with, they represent diverse stakeholders, those from the public sector, private sector, those who operate at the national level, based here in the capital, Port Vila, as well as those at subnational levels, including the provincial authorities, local governments, likewise with the private sector themselves, not only in the formal sector, but also the informal sector. Women and youth enterprise owners, as well as prospective entrepreneurs belonging to those groups, likewise with civil society groups, including the churches, those people with special needs, including those who are in prisons, likewise with academics and development partners. So they were part of the group who were consulted in order to formulate this private sector development strategy. That's a key feature of the strategy itself. Now, with regards to the strategy proper, it has 8 priority areas, 5 of which relate to standard or conventional interventions that relate to the private sector. For example, improving the business regulatory environment, improving access to finance, improving the quality of infrastructure. So besides those conventional areas of support for the private sector, the strategy has 3 unique aspects. The first one relates to supporting rural informal economies. We've got to note that, remember that UNDP estimates give, estimate those who operate in the economies of our region. It can be as high as 80% who operate within the informal economies, those in the rural areas. And during our consultations, what we found was that rural entrepreneurship is healthy, it's alive in the rural areas, which is often forgotten by those of us in the capital and even business people. But they are there, generating income, providing employment, informally, directly and indirectly. But even though the entrepreneurship does exist out in the rural areas, there's still much that can be unleashed. There's so much potential. So the strategy focuses on supporting the development of rural informal economies. The second of the 3 hallmarks of the strategy relates to inclusivity. And the strategy does not focus only on the needs of foreign investors or large corporates, but also on micro, small, medium enterprises. Likewise with those who operate businesses in the informal sector, women-owned businesses, likewise with our young people, including those with special needs. We have the Pacific Disability Forum, which is headquartered in Suva. They also have a priority to help their members establish and run a business so that they can, generate and sustain themselves and generate their own income. Now, the big question that we've always asked is, how do we address the income generating aspirations of the 120,000 school leavers of our member countries. At the end of each November, when examinations are completed, at least 100,000 up to 120,000 school leavers leaving PNG, Solomons, Fiji and Vanuatu. A very small proportion will secure scholarships to continue with their studies. A smaller proportion might be able to find jobs within the formal sector. Where do the majority, where do they go to? So this is a group that whose needs, really we've got to pay a lot of attention to it. Yeah. Now the third aspect of the strategy is the resilience, is to do with the resilience of the private sector to climate change. We are not restricting ourselves here just to the formal sector, but also to the informal sector. And we've just had Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu, Winston in Fiji, the floods that created havoc in parts of Solomon Islands 2 years ago. And interestingly, when we were up in the highlands in Mount Hagen in May, June last year, the farmers there, the importers, the distributors were talking about their plans to sell their produce, having better access to markets, not outside of Papua New Guinea, but within the country, especially in Port Moresby. But transportation by air, not affordable. So the best option would be by, on surface, by road from Hagen down to Lae, and then by boat from Lae to the port of Lae to the port of Port Moresby. Yes, but about a month after we left them, then the advent of the drought, which destroyed their produce, their gardens. So here you have, the investment that has been made by these farmers, distributors, retailers, wholesalers, being lost as a direct result of climate change. So the strategy does have a strong focus on helping the private sector, address the need for them to prepare for natural disasters and also for them to recover. And we often hear about the availability of climate change funds, to help those who suffer from these disasters. The availability is one thing, but accessibility is the other major challenge. And there are activities included in the strategy which are targeted at enhancing the accessibility of the private sector to such funds. The MSG Secretariat cannot do that on its own, neither can the private sector do that on its own. We've got to work in partnership with government, likewise with other international agencies. So again, we're talking about partnerships here in order to enhance the resilience of the private sector to the impact of climate change.
So at least now, with the explanation you've given, I'm sure our viewers are able to understand a lot more about what this strategy is about and what it aims to achieve. Could you also tell us how this particular strategy is linked to the Sustainable Development Goals?
Yes, as I mentioned earlier, certain chapters of the strategy relate to the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's important to note that these goals have been signed and adopted by, our governments, MSG member governments, and it's a recent event, the adoption of these goals. Likewise with the private sector development strategy, which was endorsed by leaders in just last July in Honiara. There are no direct linkages, but what we are doing here at the MSG Secretariat is we are organizing a series of private sector related events, meetings in Honiara during the week of the 19th of September. And one of the key agenda items for those meetings is how can the private sector relate to these sustainable development goals. We'll be talking to the private sector about it in partnership with the United Nations, as well as the United Nations Development Programme, as well as the International Labour Organization, or ILO. And that is to enhance the understanding of the private sector of the Sustainable Development Goals, and also to help them have an appreciation of the importance of participating in the pursuit of these goals in partnership with governments. They've got to recognize the benefits. The private sector, whenever they do business or invest, they would like to be ensured of returns. Yeah. So, to support, also important to support whole of government approach in pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, there are no linkages, direct linkages yet, so at these upcoming Honiara meetings, we are going to include an agenda item that will help address the need for the private sector to have a firm appreciation, better understanding of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the need for them to work in partnership with governments in pursuit of these goals.